We're in the pod. David, welcome to Built on Bitcoin. How are you, man?
I'm doing well. I finally made it. So it's a good day.
It's a great day. It's always a good day to talk about Bitcoin things, and you guys are definitely at the bleeding edge. And I think that's probably a place to start because my audience is fairly technical, and I'm fairly technical, but I actually offload a lot of my thinking to high signal individuals, and you just kind of follow the breadcrumbs. And the breadcrumbs keep leading to a few teams, Alpen being probably the most prominent of just respected building cool stuff, even though the average user cannot touch any of that currently. Like it's mostly being built. So I guess I'm just curious, why do you think that is? And what's it like being on the inside at Alpen?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think there's a return to Bitcoin as being at the intellectual center of our industry, of taking some of these very bleeding edge ideas of cryptography and actually saying, hey, we can now do this on Bitcoin. And in years past, really, I'd say 2017, 2020 cycles, there was this notion that you just can't build this stuff on Bitcoin. And there was the resistance from Bitcoin, I think rightfully so, of we don't want to change Bitcoin, we don't want to fuck with it, we don't want to introduce all this stuff that kind of put Bitcoin in this position where we avoided a lot of this innovation. But now some of the cryptography side has become so powerful with these things called zero knowledge proofs, where it's kind of reignited this conversation and people said, hey, we might be able to have our cake and eat it too. We might be able to have the best of both worlds where we can bring some of this advanced cryptography and functionality and scale to Bitcoin without making any changes to the Bitcoin base layer. And that has really just kind of lit like a flame under a lot of people and given this kind of renewed sense of hope. And several years ago, some people started introducing this research and saying that it's possible. And a lot of the people that were responsible for some of that research were on teams like ours at Alpen. Since then, there have been many other teams that have kind of come into the space and ideas like BitVM. But that's kind of the impetus. Is I think a lot of this was sparked by some advancements in cryptography that have happened over the past 4 or 5 years and are now being brought to Bitcoin.
That makes sense. And trying to think. So we have this trilemma in blockchains. You can have trustless or decentralized, fast or expressive, and it's usually on the spectrum. Um, and I guess one topic on this question of rollups and Bitcoin is my understanding is there is no trustless rollup on Ethereum either. So why are we so bullish on it being better on Bitcoin when we have less to do on less expressivity on the L1 when Ethereum should be the perfect proving ground for them working over there, or is that wrong?
Hmm. Well, I guess there's two different questions there. One is addressing this trilemma, and then the other is this kind of trustlessness. Is this stuff decentralized in name only? So on the trilemma, we have an expression in Bitcoin that says "don't trust, verify," and what that means basically from a technical standpoint is instead of me going to someone like Coinbase and saying how much Bitcoin do I have, it's we all can run a Bitcoin node, and that Bitcoin node will download all of the data from inception of Bitcoin ever existing when Satoshi first mined Bitcoin, and it will revalidate and re-verify every single transaction until it ultimately gets to your balance, and then you can verify yourself that this is your actual balance because you have essentially audited or recomputed all of that. You're kind of brute forcing the verification. But that is obviously a kind of very brutal process because you're having to re-verify everyone else's transactions. And that's at the core of this blockchain trilemma of why blockchains don't scale, is that if we have this thing called a global state, or basically that just means if I'm verifying not just my transactions, but your transactions and Vitalik's transactions and Satoshi's transactions, like blockchain just can't scale that way. But where this trilemma, where we start to actually break through it, is with this concept known as zero knowledge proofs, where if you, Jacob, say, I want to know how much Bitcoin I have, you could brute force it and run your own node. Or I could just give you a receipt, this thing called a zero knowledge proof. It's like an unforgeable digital receipt. And it just says, here's your kind of balance. And it gives you mathematical certainty that that number is accurate. That strikes at the core of how blockchains function, why they don't traditionally scale, but then why these things like zero knowledge proofs can allow us to do it. They allow us to get the final result without having to revalidate everything in between. And that's a super, super powerful concept that we can use to scale Bitcoin. The second concept you asked about is like this idea of like trustless rollups. In theory, um, a rollup, it's like an L2, it's like a sidechain where you can take your assets from the layer one, you bridge them into this L2 ecosystem, and then without any sort of like centralized intermediary, you can bridge them back. This concept of zero knowledge proofs that I kind of just briefly touched on, like allows us to do that in theory, where you just get an unforgeable digital receipt of what you did on the L2, you post it back to the L1, it lets you withdraw. Nobody else has to be involved. Perhaps what you're hinting at here, though, is that in some of these rollups on Ethereum, they have these things called like security councils, where there is some group of people very similar to a multi-sig that could like kind of change the parameters of the rollup, where you could essentially bypass this kind of like zero knowledge proof. That is legitimate. Most of these things have security councils. But there's a couple things like the way these are usually set up is there's some sort of like time lock where it says if the security council tries to make a change, it like essentially free like the like that change won't go through for say 30 days or something. Or if it's a change to one certain part of of the program that's maybe like a higher security risk where it could steal funds or something, maybe it requires like a higher threshold of signers. So these things actually are still like primarily reliant on the cryptography of zero knowledge proofs, which gives us that trustless factor. And if there is a way for them to violate or bypass that, it's pretty well gated by like these time locks. But then ultimately, like this I think eventually it is reasonable to think that the security councils will just be burned in their entirety, and we will strictly rely on the math and cryptography. And there is a path forward for that. So hopefully that made sense. Where even in their current condition, these things are still definitively the most trust minimized and like decentralized method you have. Um, and I think there's a path for us to like completely eliminate these security councils entirely.
That makes sense. I guess quick on the ZK point, how how new is this tech? Is that why is it still like in the maturing phase? And then side note, I guess, is how close is the Bitcoin stuff to the ETH stuff when it comes to like being bleeding edge for ZK?
Mhm, mhm. Well, this concept of like zero knowledge proofs has actually been around for almost 50 years, I think since the 1970s. And there's some really cool old like photos and videos of like Hal Finney, who's, you know, a Bitcoin OG that received the first Bitcoin transaction ever of him talking about zero knowledge proofs. And so these things are pretty well understood. But it's only in the past, say, 10 years where they've become efficient enough to where they you can actually use them practically. And it's very similar to like maybe you've heard of like Moore's law. This is, you know, in semiconductors where it's like kind of like how powerful and how efficient, you know, chips have become, where it's like they just constantly like doubled like every 18 months. It's this like crazy efficiency curve. Like the rate at which zero knowledge proofs are improving is going faster than Moore's law did for computer chips. So that's really kind of like once they saw that this technology can be applied to Ethereum, as much as we rag on Ethereum and shitcoins or whatever, like they have pumped huge, gargantuan amounts of money into really doing some like amazing, insane math and, you know, building out like hardware accelerators and making this stuff actually practical. And yeah, I mean, we can use virtually all of that tooling and research and bring it to Bitcoin. We have to do it in a little bit of a different manner, which I can go into, but yes, like we can apply nearly all of it to Bitcoin.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting. And I think the manner we'll touch on because I'm assuming this leads into like BitVM and GLOCK. But before we get there, or covenants, I guess.
Mhm.
Before we get there, though, I want people to understand, and you have a pretty good pulse. I've seen you talk about like Lightning and Arc a little bit, so you have a good pulse of like the landscape of scaling Bitcoin. So, how do you see rollups versus Lightning versus Arc and some of these like prominent solutions and like the pros and cons of both? Like, for example, can we get crazy throughput on rollups or are those kind of capped? Curious how you view the general landscape.
So when it comes to things like Lightning and Arc, I think the trust assumptions of these things can be very strong. Like they can very defensively say, "Hey, this is as close as we can get to the like, you know, decentralization spectrum," and that is fantastic. But where they lack is limits that of what they can do on the expressivity or functionality, kind of like how actually programmable these things are. Lightning in particular, it's really just good for like payments. Like you and I set up a channel, and if we're equally sending each other stuff back and forth, it's like this very hyper restricted use case. But you can't really do things where you can build like a beautiful payment user experience on this. Like somebody opens up Venmo or Cash App and it's like super smooth. You can't really replicate that easily on top of Lightning or these things like borrowing protocols or lending or kind of like swapping. You kind of have to squint and it's really clunky and it's led to this like bad user experience. And if the user experience is bad, then people default back to it being custodial, that type of thing. Arc has a similar story, a different set of trade-offs. I would say it isn't quite as restrictive as Lightning, but it's still it's going to lack some amount of kind of functionality and programmability. Rollups, some people could argue that maybe the trust assumptions like aren't as like clean cut as Lightning. In my opinion, they're still incredibly decentralized and you know um it has like a one event trust assumption, which we'll talk about later. But they give you unbounded expressivity and programmability, where it's not just the EVM that you could build a rollup, and it's like, look, we can take all the Ethereum applications and bring them onto a Bitcoin L2. You could do it with Solana. You could do it with Stax's Clarity. You could do it with Starkware's Cairo. You could just build like JavaScript or Rust. Like from a programmability and expressivity, and like we want to build any arbitrary application with any sort of UX that you want, rollups definitively have that in spades. No one else can compete with that. Um, yes. Sorry, I feel like there was another half of your question.
The one other question was around I think they call it compression in
Mm.
rollup land, where it's like how much throughput could you get and like theoretically with rollups?
Okay, so there's a couple things here. Like most teams building rollups are going to market with like an EVM compatible rollup. And when you have that type where that's like the execution or the programmability layer that you're choosing, you perform transactions and some amount of data has to still be posted to the Bitcoin L1. And we can compress that down, but ultimately, if you're doing tons of activity on this EVM, you can only compress it down so much where there's only so much data that can fit into the Bitcoin L1 blocks. So if we just assume that we were only bound by, like, we can only do EVM and we have to post the data onto to Bitcoin L1, which we don't have to do that, but let's just play this out. Then you can probably get like 30 to 50 times increase in the throughput of Bitcoin with any sort of programmability that you want. To put that into, maybe people will understand these terms, like if you looked at all the activity that like Base is doing, like Coinbase's rollup and Arbitrum and Optimism and Polygon and Start, like every single Ethereum L2, you could fit all of that activity into the current Bitcoin block space. So this stuff is surprisingly more scalable than people think, but it's not yet globally scalable if you're under those confines. So the other consideration here is that you can build a rollup that isn't necessarily EVM compatible. Like you could build Lightning on top of a rollup. You could build Arc on top of a rollup. And those things don't have these same like data availability things where we have to compress a ton of data and post it onto the Bitcoin blockchain. So if somebody said, I don't like this whole DA trade-off where we have to go to Bitcoin, well, they don't have to do it. Rollups still like enable that. The other thing is, if you said, well, I still want EVM, but I want more throughput, then users could decide on a per transaction basis. They could say, I want to post my data into the Bitcoin blockchain because they want the highest level of security and kind of like trust assumptions when bridging between the L1 and the L2. But some users may say, hey, I just sent like a $5 transaction to Jacob. Like I'm fine posting this data somewhere else. I'm fine like kind of self-custodying the data. Like you can post the data anywhere. And frankly, like that's probably not that big of a deal. The trade-off there is that, if you receive $5 and you post your data on the Ethereum blockchain and Ethereum goes down and you can never recover the data, then those front funds essentially get like censored. They get frozen. They can't be stolen, but they get censored. So the point I'm making with all this, and I kind of described this in one of my videos, is people who are kind of against rollups will kind of pick like one specific thing and say, well, Bitcoin has this like DA constraints and rollups. It's like, well, okay, you don't have to post your DA on Bitcoin. You don't have to use EVM, but having like a zero knowledge verified L2 is definitively like a great solution for everyone.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the design space of the customer, the user choosing their trust assumptions, I feel like that's where the future is gonna go. Uh, it's a weird UX problem for sure, but that makes the most sense that it's not just a fee thing, but it's like what what use case requires this XYZ trust assumption? And that's totally not the game right now. It's just assume that you want max one or the other, and there's no in between.
Well, this is touching on like a little bit of an advanced topic, which you can let me know if we're going too far into it. But like the way a zero knowledge proof works is I like describing it as like a translation tool, where let's assume I say I want EVM, Bitcoin DA. Jacob, you say you're like, well, I want, to use Arc or Lightning. Somebody else says I want, perfect privacy. Somebody else says like I'm a DGen. Like you can take all of these different user preferences and you can put them into a zero knowledge proof, which compresses them down and creates it into like a shared language where even though I may have used EVM and you're using Lightning and somebody else is using like stacks and it just all of this different stuff, it basically translates all of them into one single thing that Bitcoin can understand. So this kind of goes to what you were mentioning with like different users will have different preferences, but we can do this without like fragmenting everyone else. Like we can unify all this stuff, and it's not this constant thing where somebody's like, I'm introducing a new blockchain programmability scaling thing, and come use our ecosystem. It's like everything can unify around like one core primitive that Bitcoin can understand. And if Bitcoin can understand this one language, then it can understand every single language and every single user preference out there. That's why it's such an insane concept. It's not like use our standard and a better one may pop up, 5 years from now. It's like just understand this one and you're potentially like good forever.
Hmm. So is the way well, it sounds like you're talking about this would be like a Stark or a Snark opcode that's verifying. Is that the standard that you're kind of leading onto here?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is like we need some way for Bitcoin to kind of like grok or understand or to like verify a zero knowledge proof. So a zero knowledge proof, I may have mentioned this, is like an unforgeable digital receipt that simply just says like Jacob has, one Bitcoin. Creating a zero knowledge proof is very easy. It can be done off chain. Posting that zero knowledge proof, this unforgeable digital receipt on Bitcoin, that's also very easy. It's very, very tiny and it gets posted like in the inscriptions envelope if that's meaningful, like kind of where people have stored JPEGs historically. The difficult part is it's now on your Bitcoin node, and Bitcoin sees that, but can it understand and like read this receipt? Can it actually say like, oh, like I can check this that like Jacob does in fact have one Bitcoin on this other L2. And what you had just proposed with this like ZKP verifiers, if we had some sort of soft fork change into Bitcoin where like there's an op code that it does one thing and one thing only, which is verifying this zero knowledge proof or verifying this like digital receipt. That would be the best case solution. That is like fully trustless. Uh, we would love to do that. But, we know that it's very difficult to get joint changes into Bitcoin. So much of the effort over the past couple of years has been like, how can we get Bitcoin to grok or understand or like like there is this unforgeable digital receipt on there and Bitcoin can actually understand and like verify it without making a change to Bitcoin. And that's this whole world of BitVM and what we introduced as GLOCK is like how to verify zero knowledge proofs without a soft fork.
I see. Okay, so I jumped straight to like the end game, which is like Bitcoin verifying these perfectly just through Bitcoin nodes. The intermediate step we're running towards is covenants, which give us more trust minimization, but sounds like it's not a perfect like ZKP proof. You have to do a lot there. And then the current where we're currently at, and as of like, a year and a half ago, we start with BitVM, BitVM 2, I think there's a BitVM 3, right? And then there's each one has their own kind of instantiation. So um yeah, give us a high level but quick overview of BitVM. Um I think most of us have tried to understand it and it's still complicated, so we could probably just assume even after you're done talking, we still will only barely grasp it. But for context, yeah, we're using current Bitcoin script to verify some of these things. So give me some of the BitVM landscape and like what's been going on the past kind of year and a half that leads us into the Glock conversation.
Bitcoin, or excuse me, BitVM was a paper written by Robin Linus several years ago, and it kind of like cracked open this nut to say that Bitcoin can be used to like arbitrate any sort of computation off chain. So we can just have this black box where we say we want to verify zero knowledge proofs, and some entities kind of say we're we're going to like perform this computation, anything that we essentially want, and um and instead of Bitcoin, like you programming that logic directly into Bitcoin and your nodes verifying it, you kind of like agree to this computation off chain. And then as long as one person in this kind of group, it could be 5 people, 10 people, 100 people, whatever. As long as one person says, "Hey, we agreed to run the compute like this program this way. Like we already agreed to this, and you did not follow it. Like you did not do as we said." Then they can take a transaction and post it to the Bitcoin blockchain, and essentially like allow Bitcoin to be the judge to arbitrate whether this was valid or not. In some ways, it's very similar to Lightning Network. When you and I go on the Lightning Network, we create a channel and we open it so that we can send payments to each other. And we are agreeing that we will honor and kind of like properly account for all the Bitcoin sent back and forth. If you lie, then I, as one person, can go and say, "Hey, Bitcoin, be the judge, be the arbiter. Jacob didn't follow his end of our deal that we made. You know, give me back the Bitcoin and make everything good and honest." That's basically what BitVM is doing, but we can do it instead of just two people into a channel. You can have many people, and instead of just sending payments back and forth, you can do any sort of computation. The final thing I'll say here is we don't necessarily want to do any sort of computation. All we really want to do is to be able to verify zero knowledge proof. Because if you remember, I kind of described if you can verify a zero knowledge proof, then you can verify anything because you can take any of these different complex languages and programmability, you can compress them into a zero knowledge proof, and you can verify that one common shared language. So as much as we say, "Oh, BitVM, we can verify any, or like we can do any sort of computation," it's like we only care about verifying zero knowledge proofs because that in turn allows us to do everything.
Got it. I think that might be the best description I've heard so far. So great job.
Woohoo.
Uh, I guess two things that come to mind, but first is I want to make sure I understand these things have global state, so you can do fancy DeFi things. Um, when it comes to producing or verifying a ZK proof, the person's not doing that, right? Like when I think of RGB and like I think they call it client side validation,
Mhm.
your wallet is doing something on your local machine before you even send the transaction. ZKs and rollups are not that, right? It's happening somewhere else.
Okay, so there's a couple things here. One, you started off by mentioning like global state. The rollups that are probably going to market in the next 6, 12 months are going to have a global state. Like it's going to be an EVM like Ethereum. So yes. But as I mentioned before, like you don't have to have a global state. Like you don't have to use the EVM. You can use Lightning, you can use Arc, you can use client side validation like RGB. So it's totally flexible. In the kind of global state one where we're going like an EVM style roll up, you would typically have like some sort of specialized actor that is creating the zero knowledge proof. So you and I do all these transactions on this EVM compatible layer 2. All of that those transactions are basically sent to a what's called a prover, and this could be a centralized actor. Maybe you've heard of teams like Succinct or Risk Zero or even like Starkware does proving. They send all those transactions into a big giant computer, and it spits out this unforgeable digital receipt. That unforgeable digital receipt is then what's posted on Bitcoin and then verified by BitVM or GLOCK or the ZK verifier opcode that we talked about, etc. So that is not client side proving. So you mentioned another thing called like client side validation, or this is RGB. and type stuff. And their rationale is, hey, having a global state is a really dumb idea, and we don't want everything in the world all having to be like verified by our nodes. So if I send you a transaction, Jacob, like you just have to verify that the coins I'm sending you are valid, that I actually did sign for those, that I actually did in fact have those coins, that uh, that they weren't double spent. So RGB conceptually is like a cool idea. The main problem though is, let's assume that I'm sending you coins via RGB or this client side validation protocol, and then they get sent about 1,000 other times. The person at the very end of that has to go through and verify or validate like all of the prior history of those coins. And over time, if you're sending high frequency assets, that that data can grow very, very large. And so RGB becomes impractical and not scalable for a different reason than other blockchains, but still unscalable. So the solution to client side validation protocols like RGB is actually using zero knowledge proofs. So if we walk through that same transaction again, instead of me sending you the entire history of all the coins, I just send you a zero knowledge proof, which again proves to you that here's your coins. I'm sending you one Bitcoin. You don't need to worry about all the entire rest of the history. I'm basically going to cut out all that data. You have a mathematical proof that the coins I'm sending you are valid. And the nice property is not only does this fix RGB and solves the kind of like the bloat issue, you get privacy, perfect radical privacy for free. And this is actually something that was introduced by it was a paper co-authored by Robin Linus and Jonas Nick from Blockstream, and then our chief scientist Liam Egan from Alpen. And this is called shielded CSV. So in that paradigm, the last thing I'll say here is, in order for this to work, for me to be able to send you coins that doesn't have all of the prior data and just has a compressed version of like a zero knowledge proof, you have to be able to perform zero knowledge proving basically on your phone. If you remember, I told you the global state where it's like in the ZK rollups going to market, you have to send all the data to like a big giant, computer of Succinct Labs or RISC-0 or Starkware, because they have GPUs and supercomputers that can compress all this data. For shielded CSV or client-side verification to work, you need to have something that can be proven client side, like on your mobile phone. And that's at the very, very bleeding edge of ZK, where right now it's starting to look like we're going to be able to start doing that, to where instead of us sending the data first to a giant, computer warehouse, we could just prove it straight on our phone. Like that is very, very cool.
Yeah, that's crazy. Okay, I guess one potential dumb question, but why is the prover not seen as centralized in the average rollup, or is it?
Well, the prover can't steal any funds. So let's assume I perform some sort of transactions on the layer two. The prover, they can try to be malicious, and they can say, well, I'm going to deceive these people and create like a fake proof. Well, the whole point of us verifying it on the Bitcoin side is, even if this one single centralized actor tries to be malicious, like they can't. Like, we can just check the mathematical proof. We can essentially check their work and say, were you being honest or not? So in some ways, it doesn't really matter if they're centralized and evil, because they can't lie. Now, what they can do is they could just say, well, I'm just not going to do anything. I'm not going to prove any of your transactions. And they can just stop. Um, and that puts the roll up at risk of essentially kind of like freezing until somebody else would take it upon themselves and be like, hey, God damn it, this is really annoying. Like, we were kind of relying on this centralized actor, but now I actually have to spin up my computer and I have to batch all these transactions together. And I'm just going to run the proving software and do it myself and submit it to Bitcoin. So these things being centralized, they can't steal. At worst, they can just kind of like grief you or go down, but you can always circumvent them yourself, or realistically, somebody else in the community would take it upon themselves to pick up that role. Does that make sense?
It does, and just to make sure I map terms, is this what they talk about where the the sequencer can censor you. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, it's very similar. Like, if you just think like you go onto an L2 and there's like there's a node, like there's some sort of node that's like responsible for managing the network. And a roll up, we kind of break these things apart and we have one role called a sequencer, where this is the entity that like orders your transactions. So you submit transactions and it kind of orders them into a block. And then the sequencer sends these things to approver, again, like succinct or risk zero or starkware. And then that proof is submitted to Bitcoin and then it's verified. And so you are right. Like if those roles, even if they're centralized, neither of those roles can steal. And that's the key aspect that we want. Even if they're centralized, they cannot steal. The worst thing that they could do is they just go offline or they get shut down. In which case you kind of have this like escape hatch or this escape route where somebody could say, look, everything's offline. This is a pain in the ass, but I'm just gonna, exit the roll up and get my funds back on Bitcoin and I'm safe.
Got it. Okay, that's super helpful. Yeah, it's something closer to like a network outage on like AWS, but your data's safe, your money's safe. You have escape hatches to manage that. Um, so going back to BitVM, you mentioned you can prove arbitrary computation. You have this kind of black box thing, but that's been out for a while, and people have been iterating on it, BitVM 2, etc. So if this proving like what's going on to make BitVM not good enough that we have to keep on iterating into GLOCK?
The promise of BitVM is that we can this black box, which really let's just call it ZK verification, is like, hey, we can get Bitcoin to reason about zero knowledge proofs as long as one party is honest. Like that was the promise of Bitcoin or of BitVM. Then the question is like, well, how do we actually want to do this? Like, how do we want to build that black box? And like, what are the trade offs here? And BitVM one said we're going to do a lot of this stuff off chain, but the length of time it takes to perform this ZK verification to like run the black box program is very long. Like it could take months at a time. And so it still stood up to that promise of BitVM, which is you can do this ZK verification with like a one event trust assumption. But it was kind of like people didn't really understand that, hey, this takes a shit ton of time. Like this could take like 6 months. That's brutal. So then we switched to this thing called BitVM 2, where it still had the same promise, where one of n trust assumption, and it could still perform this ZK verification, but we had to put way more data on chain. And so we were able to make the time frame shorter, or just make it to like 1 to 2 weeks to perform this verification, which is great. But the potential cost to do this is like very expensive. Where like you have to submit big Bitcoin transactions and people have to put up stakes. So it's like in BitVM 1, it was the length of time, which was an issue. BitVM 2 is like the potential cost to do this on chain. Both of these things can work, but they're just not an ideal set of trade-offs. Like they honor this one event trust assumption, verifying zero knowledge proofs off or like yeah. Uh, More recently, like we, for a number of reasons, including some of the ones that I just mentioned at Alpen, said like we need a better way to do this. And we, I think some other teams also were circling around this idea. We're looking into this concept called garbled circuits. Garbled circuits is kind of like the underlying technology that's been around for a while for things called like MPC, or you can think of it like it's the Ethereum equivalent of like multisig. And the long short of it is with garbled circuits, we can go back off chain, so which is similar to BitVM 1, but we don't have this huge length of time where it takes 6 months. It's more just like instant and fast to verify this zero knowledge proof. And so garbled circuits allow us to basically get all the properties that we want out of BitVM 1 and 2, but without the clunkiness. And that seems right now to be the most bleeding edge of like what's practical and what's like a pretty significant breakthrough. Our specific implementation that we're working on at Alpen is something called GLOCK, or garbled locks for short. And we're doing a slightly different than what other people are doing.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. And yeah, first of all, great name, and the memes have been fire. So like I like Liam in the Matrix for damn sure. Um, I'm not sure if we should jump into GLOCK. I guess one question I have is like, as a bleeding edge research team, I could see one issue being keeping research and building. Uh, because lots of teams are built on BitVM, and like if this is a step function better, then people should just use GLOCK. So right now, I guess, are you guys fully deploying GLOCK and like getting ready for launch? Is there more research going on? Like where is this at currently?
Couple things. One, yes, thank you for the funny words about like Liam in the memes. I think we were very happy with the name Glock. A lot of people in Bitcoin don't know Liam, but he's like the guy with the huge curly brown hair. He's just like crazy brilliant. You know, there's a thread where I kind of like brag about him, and he's like a true self-taught cryptographer at like the very highest levels. Like he's very brilliant, and we're very lucky to have him. Um, Regarding kind of like being a research team, so we put significant effort into BitVM too. Like, I think we were maybe like the single largest code contributor to BitVM 2. Like a lot of Liam's papers were kind of like the research that really allowed us to optimize BitVM 2. Tons of other teams deserve credit as well. There's the whole BitVM Alliance. Like Citreo was incredibly active in it. Obviously, Robin Linus and ZeroSync, and I think Babylon is in there. Bob's in there. Fiamma. Like, anyways, a lot of teams deserve credit. But like, we put a shit ton of effort into BitVM 2. And it now looks like, I mean, this is very internal conversations where we're kind of like, maybe we just skip all that and we just go straight to Glock. Like that's how I'd say like mildly concerned we are with the limitations of BitVM 2, or not the limitations, but like the clunkiness of it, and how optimistic we are on like Glock being the right approach uh to to go after. But Glock, or these garbled circuits, are not like without their challenges. And we had to kind of invent some new research to like optimize Glock so that it's actually like practical enough. So yeah, I mean, this is the difficult part of research, and something that I struggle with on the team, where it's like you have these brilliant researchers and mathematicians, and they say, well, okay, like we can optimize it, we can get better, we can get better, we can get better. It's like, stop it. Like we need to ship a product to market.
Yeah, how do you do a code freeze when you're at the bleeding edge of like trying to scale Bitcoin and the opportunity is so damn massive?
Yeah, it's very true. And you have these like weird co-opetition things where it's like everybody like, let's like cooperate, but then there's like these awkward business incentives. And so I think we try to be the best steward possible of our research, and like committing to open sourcing it all and allowing other people to do what they want with it. But sometimes yeah, the whole space is just kind of crazy sometimes. Like people just saying, they've done BitVM, or that their solution is decentralized, and I guess just nature of the beast.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen a lot of products state they're Bitcoin native and they're not Bitcoin native. So it just comes with the territory. I guess I mean you could choose where we go from here. We've been going for 40 minutes, maybe we'll go for another 10 or 20, but like would you rather deep dive more into Glock, or I think Strata is your guys' implementation of these things like that
Hmm.
the world will probably touch. Um, which one do you think is more interesting to deep dive into right now?
I'll try to give a quick high level on Glock, because I think the breakthrough there is like pretty interesting, and then we can briefly touch on Alpen, the roll up. I mentioned this term, like zero knowledge proofs, a bunch, and there are different types of zero knowledge proofs. There's like a snark, which is with an N. There's Starks with a T. Like there's different types of zero knowledge proofs, and some are big, some are fast. Like they have these different set of trade offs. And the standard for a lot of teams is to use a snark, something called a Groth 16, named after a researcher named Jonas Groth. He invented it in 2016. And Groth 16 is a standard because it's very, very tiny. I described how we can create a zero knowledge proof and you get this unforgeable digital receipt. Imagine that digital receipt is like 150 bytes, which is tiny. That's fantastic. But when we tried to create a Groth 16 verifier for GLOCK, or using this thing called garbled circuits, the verifier component of it, like to do that in this kind of like BitVM type setup, or what we call GLOCK, is like the verifier here was like very, very large, and it was impractical. So even though we had this idea for GLOCK, it's like, damn, we're looking at the best zero knowledge proof, the most efficient one on the market, this Groth 16, which is this gold standard, and it's still impractical. Like we just can't build it. And so Liam, again, our chief scientist, he kind of he basically was on a flight from I think like Singapore to the US, and he always jokes that he doesn't bring any devices. He just like stares at the back of the seat and like just stares off into nothingness, and it's like math just happens. It's like that's wild, you know. And so on the flight, he basically like invented a new snark. It was inspired by a team who did like the Perry snark. They deserve a lot of credit. PARI, and he basically modified that snark. So now it's smaller than the Groth 16 one that I mentioned, and the verifier that we can create with GLOCK to verify this new snark is significantly, like orders of magnitude, more simple. So the long short of this is garbled circuits is like a better version of BitVM, but it's not practical. We had to invent this new snark that Liam invented, and then use that to create a garbled circuits verifier. And that is what's now actually making this stuff practical. The combination of garbled circuits, which is what some people call BitVM 3, with this novel snark that Liam invented, the baby there is GLOCK. And that seems to be the only practical way to do garbled circuits or BitVM 3 right now. There are other teams that are working on making this efficient with Groth 16, and they, I think, are getting closer to making it practical. So jury's still out on that, but you could see there's like a whole bunch of different moving research happening here.
All right, very cool. I mean, first of all, it was hard not to continue laughing at the Liam raw dogging flight story and just having like epiphanies. Like we got to call that like the Liam method or something because that's pretty genius. The the verifier piece. Um, I remember talking to the BitLayer guys, and I think they were talking about the verifier is huge, so you chunk it and then you put it on the blockchain, and then you can kind of like recombobulate it or whatever. Um, so I guess to double click on that, one, the verifier has to be on chain for this to work. Is that one piece? And then what is the different kind of like snark that he created? I think you guys call it a designated verifier snark.
Mhm.
So yeah, two questions
So
there. One is like, does the verifier script have to be on chain? And then yeah, two, let's double click in the DV snark thing a little bit.
So what you just described there with kind of like the bit layer guys talking about this chunking and it has to go on chain, that is BitVM 2. We had BitVM 1, which most of it happened off chain. But if you remember, the length of time to perform this was very long. And then we switched to BitVM 2, which said, look, we're going to put it on chain. And the only way to fit it on chain is we do this thing called chunking. I don't need to go into the details here, but we kind of like cut it up and put it into pieces into the Bitcoin blockchain. But that costs a fuck ton of like, or excuse my language, but like it costs a ton of like on chain data cost. So that's kind of like the old model, or like some people like BitLayer and I think Citrea, those guys are going to market, I think, with a BitVM 2 type setup. But that's something where I'm like, like we at Alpen didn't really like that. It's kind of clunky. It's not very economically efficient. And in that setup, you are creating this thing called like a Groth 16 verifier, and you're doing it on Bitcoin. If I tried to make that more simple, to verify a zero knowledge proof, any zero knowledge proof, you're basically doing multiplications. Bitcoin cannot do multiplications. It can do additions. So when we're creating this verifier on chain, it basically means we're taking like op addition, op addition, op addition, op, like, like we're basically emulating multiplication, like very advanced multiplication in like Bitcoin script. So that's kind of why this thing is so huge. That's why the BitLayer guys say we need to like chunk it. But all of that is to do a Groth 16 verifier in Bitcoin script on chain. Now, with garbled circuits, you can move all of that verifier logic off chain. But if you try to do this Groth 16 verifier, that's when the storage costs become very huge. Like the verifier is still huge. We remove it off chain, which is great, but it's still huge. So that's when Liam created this new snark. And typically the way a snark works is like if we post it on Bitcoin, then anyone can observe that. Anyone can open up their node and be like, oh, there's this little snark here, and you can verify if it's true. Like you, Jacob, it's permissionless. Anyone can view it. There are certain types of snarks or zero knowledge proofs where it's called like a designated verifier, where only a fixed group of people actually have the ability to observe that snark and verify it's true. Everyone else just looks like a blob of data. But if you, Jacob, have like the key you can unlock that, see that it's a snark, and then you can verify it. And so Liam's innovation here is essentially a designated verifier snark where only a fixed set of people can verify it. The reason we're okay with that is BitVM in this paradigm of garbled circuits, like it has to be permissioned anyways, where like in order for the bridge, like the ZK verification to happen, like you are saying, hey, 10, 20, 50, 100 people like are responsible. And as long as one of those entities is honest, then the bridge is secure. So if you're already accepting that assumption that, hey, you're already trusting like a permissioned group of actors, then making this a designated verifier snark it's not adding anything to the trust model. So that's really kind of like the secret sauce of how we were able to do this.
Got it. I'm trying to work through other models people might have in their head because people know about federations,
Mhm.
and it's like a permission set of people that are doing the verifying, but also typically control the peg in, peg outs. Um, so it's kind of like a federation, except the custody of funds is much, much better. But you're choosing a federation, if you will, a group of designated verifiers that can't steal as long as one person is being good. Um, but you don't have to put this on chain because it's unnecessary. You're just moving the federation verification piece off to the side.
Yeah, I think that's actually a perfect explanation. You have this group of entities, you can call them a federation or not, but in the old school model, you need the honest majority of them. You need over 50% of them to be honest. That's kind of the way that it works in Stacks' SBTC peg and Liquid's LBTC peg and Rootstock's RSK peg. In this, yes, you have a group of actors. Some of those would be the biggest companies in our entire industry. There could be a few anons on there. Like you can get this geographical distribution and no shared data centers. And, like you can set these things up very strong. And again, as long as you trust one entity to be honest there, then the bridge is secure, as opposed to relying on the honest majority of entities.
Got it. And is the and you do have different models like SBTC. I think is partially economically secured, which is that has its whole set of trade offs. Liquid is a little more clear, and there's reputation based for the most part. Like the entities. It sounds like this is closer to that, which is that because you have this one event trust assumption, and I'm assuming the verifiers are known, then the chance that one person's not gonna you're not gonna have 15 people ruin their reputation, and one of them will be good enough that you'll know they'll be doing the right thing. So it's at the end of the day, it's like very trust minimized, and you have this traditional kind of like brand or reputation angle that incentivizes everybody to be that one event person.
That's mostly right. If I had to like rank these, I would say worst case is like you're trusting like one person. It's like you have like Justin Sun like controlling the node. Next better off that is you have like a federation kind of like Liquid or Rootstock where it's like reputation based. I'd say even better than that is what Stacks has with SBTC where there's like economic incentives at play, and then and then you have like the one event kind of GLOCK based bridge where you're trusting one person. It's also worth mentioning that when we do set up this kind of like the GLOCK permission group of actors, like these actors, they just do still have to put up some amount of BTC stake. So there is an economic component, and they do get slashed if they're found to be malicious. But fortunately, those entities you don't have to over collateralize the peg. Like in Stacks' SBTC, I think they're putting up at STX, and so and it has to be over collateralized. If you put in, say, like $1 million, you need $1.5 million or whatever of FTX. And in these GLOCK based bridges, like we don't yet have the exact numbers, but like the point is, you don't need to over collateralize. If you put in $1 billion, you don't need to have $2 billion of BTC slashed. Like it's far, far, far more economically efficient.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a question that just left me. I guess the question now then is like when can we play with these things? The classic when soon question. So yeah, what's cooking, and like will we get out of white paper hell anytime soon?
Gosh. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword of being a research team. There are a few teams that are going to market, I think, as soon as this year, before the end of the year, with like these more BitVM 2 style bridges. I'm curious to see how those play out, and curious to see some of the issues that I mentioned with the economic inefficiencies and the clunkiness of it. But that's a massive, massive step forward, and those teams deserve huge credit. For us at Alpen, since I think we've decided most likely to like bypass that and go straight to Glock, we're probably looking closer to. I mean, we're aiming for end of the year. I wouldn't be surprised if it bleeds into first thing next year. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
All right, wait and see. Um, I don't think I have any other questions. I mean, I'm sure people, if people want to get involved, like they want to build, is it too early to kind of point them to you guys? And I guess first question, is this going to be EVM compatible for the initial one? So builders will have to know Solidity and all that if they want to build on Alpin.
Yeah, so we're on a public testnet right now. You can go to docs.alpenlabs.io. You can either follow us on Twitter, you can go to our Telegram. If you guys hit us up, we'll be happy to help. For now, yes, it will be EVM. I think the grand vision that people are eventually going to see here is kind of what I hinted at before, where you can have EVM, you could have Clarity, you could have Cairo, you could have privacy, like you could have all of these different, roll-ups or execution environments, and they can all use this one primitive of Glock, and they can all potentially share liquidity, they can cross compose, like you don't have this fragmentation issue. So the EVM, just because of the network effect, will be the first, and it will probably be the most popular, but that doesn't necessarily mean these rollups like have to be EVM, and that's lost a lot on the critics.
That makes sense. All right, I guess final question. Are you running knots? No, I'm just kidding. Are
Hell
you
no.
Man, all that stuff is so crazy to me. I'm just like, this is so stupid. It's only going to end one way, and we're wasting a bunch of time. The question, though, on the opco debate, which hopefully we get back to sometime soon. Where are you most bullish, or what do you wish we could get into Bitcoin?
Well, it's funny. I saw Craig from Bitcoin Magazine. He actually posted and he said, if Knots decided to merge like CTV and CheckSig from Stack, like that, activate that soft fork, he's like, I would actually consider running Knots. And I was like, oh man, that's quite the bargain there. It's like maybe I will turn into a
Totally.
Nazi if they activated a soft fork. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a long wish list of, maybe not a long one, but a small wish list of things that I would love to see come to Bitcoin. If it's some sort of like ZKP verifier, if you had even just op multiplication, like just allowing Bitcoin to do multiplication would be great. I think Cat would be great, but it does feel like we lost some momentum. But there was some forming around like getting CTV, check template verify, along with check sig from Stack. I think maybe people were talking about adding some other stuffs like the key tweaking, IT, whatever it is. And yeah, like I just, all that stuff, like that CTV and check stick for stack, it wouldn't be a game changer for us, but it would be like it would be beneficial. And for me, it's just more important for Bitcoin to like flex that muscle, not let it atrophy, and know that, hey, like we're just not like ossification is death. And to like reestablish that, I think would be very important. Um, it seems like people are waking up to it.
Yeah. Um, I guess one question. This happened early on with the OpCat debate, where when I was at the Bitcoin Frontier Fund, we saw some early teams raising, assuming OpCat would go live, and I was
Yeah.
like, "That's crazy." So as a research team, how much do you kind of like work into research and optimize for, CTV being live versus just like focusing on within the constraints and building what's actually possible currently?
Both. I mean, we kind of lead, our primary effort is assuming that like no soft fork whatsoever is coming. And that's kind of why I'm at peace with all of the debates. I'm like, all right, look, I would love to have this better functionality, make it cleaner, more elegant, but we're just doing it anyways. Whether people like what we're doing or not, like we're dealing within consensus, and it's all good. So, um, but I think we're also kind of always keeping an eye on these like crazy mythical forms of cryptography, things that people won't be familiar with, but like called functional encryption or witness encryption or indistinguishability obfuscation, like these ideas that maybe could one day allow you to do everything from covenants to ZKP verification to anything you possibly imagine with no change to Bitcoin whatsoever. A lot of that is kind of like mythical god tier math that isn't yet practical, but like we're at least keeping an eye on some of that.
Very cool. Well, man, I got nothing else. Any closing thoughts or stuff you want to wax poetically on to bring it to a close?
I'm sure I could, but I think this was a fun podcast. It's enjoyable for me to kind of nerd out about it. I really want to hit home the point to people that there's never been a more exciting time in Bitcoin. I know people come into it for like the number go up, but there's a real true like intellectual renaissance that's happening, and that can get us back to, I think, some like real deal serious innovation. And I think people should be super stoked on being in Bitcoin right now at like this moment in time when this stuff is happening.
Yep, couldn't agree more. All right, man. I think we'll close it there. I'll have links below for all the good stuff you guys are working on, and especially the white paper. But thank you for coming on, chopping it up, and dropping knowledge.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.
Thank you for listening this far into the episode. If you found it enjoyable, please do like, subscribe on whatever platform that you're listening on. YouTube does me a huge favor to like and subscribe. Find me on Twitter at Jake Blocktrade. Show me some love. I reply to every DM. All right, peace.
It's gone up. We playing the long game to the black rock chains with the racks paid off from the blockchain. Going up high octane, so we up in here like pomade. Making big noise, big money, go play with your kid toys. You funny, I'm counting my Bitcoin. We up and we been gone. It's gone. Planned it out and we did this purposefully. Panning out like the kitchen currently. It's like surgery, way it's earning me a nurse's salary for cryptocurrency. I'm on a vacay drinking coconuts while wearing polka dots. This ain't no hocus pocus. Listen up and learn. It's gone up.